Welcome to Luxurious Tales. If you love powerful stories, don't forget to like, share, and comment. Subscribe to Luxurious Tales and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new tale. Listen closely. The story begins now. Tessa Whitmore had always been underestimated. Growing up in a small town, she was the quiet girl in the back of the classroom, scribbling down dreams in a notebook no one cared to look at. Raised by her mother, Miriam, a factory worker who never had enough, Tessa's world was shaped by the struggle. They lived in a cramped apartment above an old diner, where the windows rattled every time a truck passed. Yet, Tessa always saw beyond the smallness of her life. Her heart was full of dreams, none more cherished than opening a small chain of neighborhood grocery stores, where people could feel seen, cared for, and valued. It wasn't much, but it was hers. At Greenmart, Tessa poured herself into every customer, remembering names, favorite products, even the kids' birthdays. She was kind, but there was a sharpness in her that many overlooked, her intelligence, the way she could calculate a discount in her head faster than anyone could type it into the register. Clara Bennett, her best friend since childhood, was the only person who truly saw her. Clara, grounded and practical, had always warned her about being more than just the girl behind the counter. Yet, Tessa's focus remained on building a life where she didn't have to apologize for the things she couldn't control, her past, her mother's struggles, or her current job. One quiet afternoon, as the hum of the store buzzed around her, Tessa's mind drifted back to her estranged aunt, Lorraine Whitmore, whom she hadn't seen in years. Tessa's mother, Miriam, had never spoken of Lorraine without a bitterness that burned the air. Lorraine had married into money, becoming a silent queen of a sprawling shipping empire. But it wasn't just the wealth that kept them apart, it was a bitter inheritance dispute that left a rift between the sisters, one that Miriam never healed from. Tessa didn't know much about Lorraine's life, other than the fact that her aunt had long turned her back on them. Yet, on those lonely nights, when the weight of her mother's absence pressed on her chest, Tessa wondered if Lorraine knew what had become of her. Did Lorraine know that Tessa, the girl who used to help her mother clean the floors of a greasy diner, had bigger dreams than stocking shelves? Could Lorraine, in her marble halls and expensive suits, ever have imagined that Tessa, her own flesh and blood, could someday rise from the shadows of grocery aisles into a life of independence? Tessa's daydreams were interrupted by a familiar voice. Clara walked into the store, her heels clicking on the polished tiles. Clara was the opposite of Tessa, sharp, ambitious, and always ready to push her friend toward the next step. As Clara made her way over to the counter, Tessa smiled, though her heart still felt heavy with the unspoken questions about her past. "You know," Clara said with a sly grin, "you are more than just a cashier here. Have you thought about what you're going to do next?" Clara's voice held a knowing edge. Tessa knew that tone, it was the same one she had heard from Clara countless times. The truth was, Clara didn't just want Tessa to survive, she wanted her to thrive, to make a mark in the world that everyone would remember. But Tessa's world had always been small, and she couldn't help but wonder if that was where she would always stay. "I've got time," Tessa replied, her gaze lingering on the door to the street, where people passed by without a glance. But deep down, she knew Clara was right. Time was running out, and so was the quiet life she had built. Blake Harrington grew up in a house where silence meant tension and laughter meant denial. His father had once owned a small hardware business that collapsed during an economic downturn, and the shame of that bankruptcy hung over the family like a permanent storm cloud. Blake remembered collection notices stacked on the kitchen table, his mother whispering late at night about overdue bills, and the way neighbors suddenly stopped making eye contact. From that young age, he decided he would never be the man people pitied. Losing, to Blake, was not just failure, it was humiliation. In high school, he masked insecurity with charisma, becoming the loudest in the room, the quickest with jokes, the most competitive on the field. Even when he lost a local football scholarship opportunity, he framed it as their mistake. Deep down, though, rejection carved something sharp inside him. He promised himself that one day he would stand in front of cameras, admired, envied, untouchable. Poverty, he believed, was not just a circumstance, it was a stain he intended to scrub off his name forever. In his early 20s, Blake hustled relentlessly. He worked as a gym receptionist, a car dealership assistant, and even handed out flyers for small events, anything that kept him visible. He studied sports commentary obsessively, mimicking delivery styles in front of mirrors, practicing facial expressions, sharpening his voice until it carried authority. That hunger eventually led him to Oliver Kane, a mid-level talent agent known for spotting ambition more than talent. Oliver saw in Blake what others overlooked: relentless drive wrapped in charm. During their first meeting at a modest downtown cafe, Blake spoke not about gratitude or patience but about domination. He wanted prime time. He wanted endorsement deals. He wanted to be the face people trusted and feared. Oliver, pragmatic and image-driven, warned him that fame required sacrifice. Blake agreed instantly, not fully understanding what that sacrifice might cost. He believed success would fix everything: his father's embarrassment, his mother's quiet anxiety, even the small apartment he still lived in. What he did not realize was that ambition, when untethered from empathy, could quietly erode the very things that gave life meaning. By the time Blake met Tessa Whitmore, he had already begun shaping himself into the man he thought the world wanted. He dressed sharper, spoke smoother, and carried himself with calculated confidence. Yet behind that polish was a constant fear of slipping backward. He avoided places that reminded him of struggle and distanced himself from friends who seemed content with modest lives. When Oliver secured him small guest appearances on regional sports panels, Blake treated each opportunity like a championship final. He stayed late in studios, networking aggressively, memorizing statistics, volunteering for unpaid segments just to remain visible. Winning was not enough; he needed to dominate perception. Losing meant disappearing. And disappearing, to Blake Harrington, was worse than death. As he climbed slowly upward, he convinced himself that the world was divided into two categories: those who rose and those who remained stuck. He vowed never to belong to the second group again, even if it meant hardening parts of himself he once valued. The night Tessa Whitmore met Blake Harrington, the sky had split open without warning. Rain poured down in relentless sheets, turning sidewalks into shallow rivers and forcing strangers to huddle beneath the narrow shelter of a bus stop near Greenmart. Tessa had just finished a double shift, her uniform slightly damp at the edges, her hair pulled back loosely as she clutched her canvas bag close to her chest. She had always liked rainy evenings; they felt cleansing, almost symbolic, as if the world was washing itself clean of disappointment. Blake, on the other hand, stood impatiently beside her, tapping his polished shoe against the pavement as if the storm had personally insulted him. He had just left a networking event where his handshake had been firm but his opportunity uncertain. Their eyes met when a strong gust of wind sent Tessa's umbrella flipping inside out. Blake caught it midair with a quick reflex, laughing lightly as he handed it back. "Guess the weather doesn't respect anyone's plans," he joked. Tessa smiled politely, unaware that this brief, rain-soaked encounter would shift the course of her life in ways she could never predict. The bus was delayed, forcing them into unexpected conversation. Blake spoke first, filling the silence with easy charm, asking about her work, her neighborhood, her dreams. Unlike others who dismissed her job as ordinary, he listened closely when she described the small notebook she carried everywhere, a journal filled with ideas about grocery layouts, customer service improvements, and neighborhood outreach. She explained how she dreamed of building stores that treated customers like family rather than transactions. Blake was amused but intrigued. Ambition, no matter the scale, resonated with him. In return, he shared his desire to become a recognizable sports commentator, someone whose voice people associated with major moments. He described growing up around financial struggle, though he polished the story carefully, presenting himself as resilient rather than wounded. Tessa noticed his intensity but mistook it for passion. When the bus finally arrived, they sat side by side, the air between them charged with new curiosity. By the time she reached her stop, Blake had asked if she would join him for coffee the following afternoon. She hesitated only briefly before agreeing, feeling a flutter of possibility she hadn't experienced in years. Their first coffee date took place in a modest cafe with scratched wooden tables and soft jazz humming in the background. Blake arrived early, dressed sharply, projecting confidence that bordered on theatrical. Tessa arrived moments later, wearing a simple cardigan and carrying her dream journal tucked discreetly under her arm. Conversation flowed easily. Blake admired her sincerity, she admired his drive. They spoke about childhood memories, favorite meals, embarrassing teenage stories, and hopes for the future. Blake painted a vivid picture of stadium lights and televised interviews, while Tessa described a storefront filled with warm lighting and shelves stocked thoughtfully for every budget. They laughed over shared frustrations about being underestimated. That evening stretched longer than either anticipated, and when they parted ways outside the cafe, the rain had stopped entirely. The air felt different, cleaner, expectant. Neither of them realized it then, but beneath the sweetness of that beginning lay subtle differences in values that would one day collide. For now, however, there was only excitement, a sense that perhaps two ambitious souls had found comfort in each other's company, unaware that storms far heavier than rain were waiting on the horizon. Their wedding took place on a quiet Thursday morning at the county courthouse, witnessed only by Clara Bennett and an old college acquaintance of Blake's who happened to be available on short notice. There were no extravagant flowers, no orchestra, no dramatic vows echoing through stained glass windows. Tessa wore a simple cream dress she had found on clearance, and Blake wore a tailored suit he insisted was an investment in the future. Despite the modest setting, Tessa's smile radiated pure belief. She believed in partnership, and shared burdens, and building something brick by brick. After signing the papers, they celebrated with pancakes at a diner where the waitress insisted on giving them free coffee after overhearing the occasion. That afternoon, they moved into a tiny one-bedroom apartment on the 4th floor of an aging building with creaky staircases and unreliable heating. To Tessa, it felt like a beginning full of promise. To Blake, it felt temporary, a stepping stone he planned to leave behind as quickly as possible. The early months of their marriage were filled with long conversations about ambition and sacrifice. Tessa worked extended shifts at Green Mart, sometimes covering for coworkers to earn extra pay, while Blake attended auditions and networking mixers that often ended in polite rejection. On nights when he returned discouraged, she would cook simple meals and remind him of his talent, encouraging him not to internalize setbacks. She kept her dream journal on the kitchen counter, jotting ideas between stirring sauces and folding laundry. Blake admired her resilience, yet he also grew restless. He hated watching her come home exhausted, smelling faintly of produce and detergent, while he chased interviews that rarely materialized. Arguments occasionally flared, not explosive but sharp. He accused himself of not moving fast enough. She reassured him that growth required patience. The tension wasn't yet destructive, but it simmered beneath the surface, fueled by differing timelines and unspoken fears about stagnation. As bills accumulated, the apartment began to feel smaller, its thin walls amplifying both laughter and disagreement. Blake became more sensitive about finances, checking their bank balance late at night with a clenched jaw. Tessa noticed how quickly his mood shifted when discussing money, how the word average seemed to wound him. Yet she remained committed, believing that love required endurance. She brought home discounted pastries from the store, turning modest evenings into small celebrations. They hosted Clara once for dinner, squeezing 3 chairs around a narrow table, joking about how one day they would look back on this cramped space and laugh. Clara observed quietly, sensing the imbalance beginning to tilt, Tessa giving reassurance freely, Blake absorbing it hungrily without fully reciprocating. Still, in those early days, there was genuine affection. They fell asleep holding hands on a sagging mattress, whispering about future houses, future success, future stability. Neither could foresee how fragile that closeness would become once ambition and pride began to outweigh gratitude and loyalty. Blake's first real opportunity arrived on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon when Oliver Kane called with unusual urgency in his voice. A regional sports network had lost a weekend panelist unexpectedly, and they needed someone sharp, energetic, and available immediately. Blake nearly dropped his phone in excitement. He paced the small apartment while Oliver outlined the conditions: low pay, high visibility, and a trial period that could either elevate or erase him. Tessa, still in her Green Mart uniform, listened from the kitchen doorway with wide, hopeful eyes. She had never seen Blake so alive. That weekend, she ironed his shirt twice to ensure no crease betrayed their modest circumstances. When she watched him on television for the first time, seated confidently under bright studio lights, her chest swelled with pride. His voice carried authority, his smile measured and charming. For a moment, it felt like every sacrifice, every late bill, every cramped dinner had been worth it. Blake returned home past midnight, energized and glowing with adrenaline, already speaking of what might come next. In the weeks that followed, subtle changes crept in. Blake began paying closer attention to his wardrobe, purchasing sharper suits on credit, convincing himself that appearance was strategy. He practiced speaking more deliberately, refining his posture, adjusting even his laugh to sound less boyish and more commanding. Tessa supported him wholeheartedly, though she noticed he spent less time asking about her shifts or her dream journal ideas. Instead, conversations revolved around ratings, viewer engagement, and potential sponsors. Oliver's presence became more frequent, phone calls during dinner, strategy sessions that stretched late into the night. Oliver emphasized perception above all else, advising Blake to maintain a clean narrative. When Blake casually mentioned Tessa's grocery job during one broadcast, Oliver later suggested he be more selective with personal disclosures. Audiences connect with aspiration, Oliver warned. Blake nodded thoughtfully, absorbing the message without fully examining its implications. Tessa brushed off the shift at first, attributing it to excitement and pressure. But somewhere inside her, a quiet unease began forming. One evening, after Blake secured a second appearance on the network, he invited a few colleagues to the apartment for drinks. The cramped space felt tighter than ever under the scrutiny of strangers dressed in sleek jackets and polished shoes. Tessa prepared snacks carefully, smiling warmly as she introduced herself. Yet she caught Blake hesitating before describing what she did for a living, his tone subtly changing when he mentioned Green Mart. It was brief, almost imperceptible, but she noticed. Later, as the guests left, Blake seemed distracted, already scrolling through messages from Oliver about future segments. Tessa stood at the window watching city lights flicker against the dark sky, trying to silence the whispering doubt rising within her. She wanted to believe this was growth, not transformation. But as Blake began measuring success in recognition rather than gratitude, the balance of their partnership shifted ever so slightly. The first break had arrived, and with it came the faint outline of a divide neither of them yet acknowledged. The invitation arrived embossed in gold lettering, announcing an exclusive dinner hosted by the regional network's executives at a high-rise restaurant overlooking the city skyline. Blake stared at it as though it were a trophy. "This is it," he said quietly, almost reverently. Tessa felt both pride and nervousness flutter through her chest. She borrowed a navy dress from Clara, something elegant but understated, and spent extra time smoothing her hair and choosing subtle makeup. As they entered the restaurant, chandeliers glimmered overhead and waiters moved silently between tables dressed in black and white. Blake's posture straightened instantly, his smile became polished, almost rehearsed. Tessa noticed the way he scanned the room for recognition, for acknowledgement. When introductions began, she extended her hand warmly, speaking with confidence about her work at Green Mart and her long-term dream of community-based grocery expansion. Some executives nodded politely, others barely concealed their indifference. Blake laughed too quickly when one man joked about loving a good discount. It was subtle, but Tessa felt it, the first flicker of embarrassment in his eyes. As the evening progressed, wine flowed and conversations shifted toward market growth and audience demographics. Oliver Kane dominated much of the discussion, painting Blake as the network's rising star. Tessa remained attentive but observant. She caught snippets of dialogue about image alignment and sponsorship appeal. When one executive casually asked what she did, Blake responded before she could, simplifying her role into something almost trivial. "She keeps things grounded," he said lightly, though the tone carried a faint dismissal. The table laughed, not maliciously but carelessly. Tessa forced a smile, her stomach tightening. Clara's earlier warnings echoed faintly in her mind, about tone shifts, about subtle changes that precede larger ones. Blake's hand rested on her knee under the table, but the gesture felt performative rather than affectionate. For the first time, Tessa sensed that the world Blake was entering might not have room for the simplicity he once admired in her. On the drive home, silence filled the car. City lights streaked past like restless thoughts neither wanted to voice. Blake broke the quiet first, commenting on how important it was to maintain a certain perception in professional circles. He suggested gently, too gently, that perhaps she could consider something more aligned with his growing public presence. Tessa stared out the window, absorbing the implication without immediate response. She had never been ashamed of her job, it was honest work, built on patience and care. Yet now it seemed to represent something Blake was trying to outrun. When they reached their apartment, she placed her borrowed dress carefully back into its garment bag, smoothing it as though smoothing her own doubts. Blake kissed her forehead distractedly before checking messages from Oliver. The crack in his smile that evening was small, almost invisible, but it was there, and once seen, it could not be unseen. The highway was slick with evening drizzle, the kind that blurred headlights into streaks of white and gold. Blake insisted on driving home from a late networking event, his energy still buzzing from conversations about potential contracts. Tessa sat beside him, tired but content, scrolling through photos Clara had sent of her new classroom decorations. The city lights reflected off the windshield, creating a hypnotic rhythm. Blake's phone vibrated against the dashboard, Oliver's name flashing across the screen. Blake hesitated only a second before glancing down to read the message. It was brief, a reflex more than a decision, but it was enough. The vehicle ahead braked suddenly. Tires screeched. Metal collided with a force that felt like the sky collapsing. Tessa's scream was cut short by impact. The world flipped into chaos, shattered glass, the scent of burning rubber, the violent stillness that follows destruction. When the car stopped moving, the silence was heavier than the crash itself. Blake's hands trembled on the steering wheel as he called her name, but Tessa couldn't answer. She felt nothing below her waist, only a distant ringing in her ears and a strange, hollow fear spreading through her chest. Sirens pierced the night within minutes. Mason Reed was among the first paramedics to arrive, his movements precise and steady despite the urgency. He assessed the scene quickly, instructing his team with calm authority. Blake stumbled out of the car, shaken but physically unharmed, repeating that it was an accident, that he hadn't meant for any of it to happen. Mason focused on Tessa, who remained conscious but pale, her breathing shallow. She tried to move her legs but felt only emptiness. "Stay with me," Mason said gently as they secured her onto a stretcher. His voice was grounded, reassuring, cutting through the panic. Blake watched helplessly as they loaded her into the ambulance, the flashing lights casting harsh shadows across his face. In that moment, ambition, image, and status dissolved into something far more fragile, the realization that life could fracture in a single distracted second. At the hospital, sterile lights replaced the chaos of the highway. Doctors rushed Tessa into emergency evaluation while Blake sat in the waiting area, hands clasped tightly, replaying the moment his eyes dropped to his phone. Time stretched unbearably. When a physician finally approached, the words felt unreal. Spinal trauma. Severe inflammation. Temporary paralysis likely, but recovery uncertain. Blake nodded mechanically, barely absorbing the gravity of it. Tessa was moved into a recovery room hours later, her body still, machines humming softly around her. When she awoke fully, confusion gave way to terror as she tried again to move her legs. Nothing responded. Blake stood beside her bed, whispering reassurances he barely believed himself. Outside the hospital room, rain continued to fall quietly, washing the streets clean of visible damage. But inside, something irreversible had shifted. The night that began with promise had rewritten their lives in ways neither of them could yet comprehend. The hospital room became Tessa's new world, defined by antiseptic scents and the soft beeping of monitors that marked time more accurately than clocks. The first morning after surgery, she stared at the ceiling tiles, tracing their patterns as if they might reveal answers. When she tried again to move her legs, the silence from her body felt louder than any scream. Dr. Raymond Cole introduced himself with measured calm, explaining the nature of spinal trauma with careful honesty. He did not promise miracles, but he did not close doors either. Swelling needed to subside. Rehabilitation would be long. Outcomes varied. Tessa listened intently, absorbing every word, her fingers gripping the hospital sheets. Blake stood beside her, nodding along, though his gaze often drifted toward his buzzing phone. Medical bills were already being discussed. Insurance forms piled up. The weight of uncertainty pressed heavily on both of them, but they carried it differently, Tessa with fear of losing independence, Blake with fear of losing control. Days blurred into one another under fluorescent lighting. Nurses rotated in quiet shifts, adjusting 4 lines and offering gentle encouragement. Mason Reed visited once during a break, checking on her progress with respectful distance. Tessa appreciated his steady presence. He spoke to her as if she were still fully herself, not defined by a hospital bed. Blake, however, grew visibly restless. He paced during phone calls with Oliver, lowering his voice when discussing upcoming broadcasts. His career was accelerating just as Tessa's body had stalled. When reporters began reaching out after learning of the accident, Oliver advised discretion. "Keep the narrative tight," he insisted. Blake complied, describing the incident publicly as a serious but manageable setback. Tessa overheard fragments of these conversations, feeling something fracture quietly inside her. She was not a setback. She was his wife. Yet in Blake's tone, she sensed the subtle shift, an attempt to compartmentalize her condition rather than confront its emotional reality. One evening, after visitors had left and the hallway noise softened, Tessa allowed herself to cry without restraint. The vulnerability felt raw, unfamiliar. She had always been strong, the one who steadied others. Now she could not even sit up without assistance. Blake tried to comfort her, but his reassurance felt hurried, distracted. He spoke of future treatments and cutting-edge therapies, yet avoided direct acknowledgement of his own guilt. Dr. Cole returned later that night with a more detailed rehabilitation plan, outlining months of physical therapy and gradual neurological assessment. It was not hopeless, but it was uncertain. As hospital lights dimmed for the evening, Tessa stared at the darkened window, her reflection faint against the glass. She wondered who she would become if her legs never responded again. And somewhere beneath her grief, a deeper question stirred: who would Blake become if her recovery did not align with his rising ambitions? Rehabilitation began with small, humbling exercises that forced Tessa to confront the fragility of her own body. Physical therapists moved her limbs carefully, stimulating muscles that felt disconnected from her will. The first time they transferred her into a wheelchair, she felt both grateful and defeated. The hospital corridors seemed longer from that seated perspective, as if the world had quietly expanded beyond her reach. Dr. Raymond Cole remained steady, explaining that neural pathways sometimes needed time and repetition to reconnect. "Progress rarely announces itself loudly," he told her. Tessa clung to those words. Blake attended the first few therapy sessions, watching with folded arms as she strained to lift even a fraction of her weight. He offered encouragement, but impatience flickered behind his eyes. Recovery was not dramatic. It was slow, repetitive, unglamorous. And Blake, accustomed to rapid career milestones, struggled to adjust to a process that refused to move at his pace. Outside the hospital, the story of the accident circulated quietly online. A few local blogs mentioned it, attaching Blake's name more prominently than Tessa's. Comments ranged from sympathy to speculation. Some questioned his driving. Others praised his resilience. Oliver advised him to maintain composure and avoid emotional interviews. "Control the narrative," he repeated. Blake complied, appearing composed on camera, speaking briefly about family focus without revealing details. Meanwhile, Tessa returned home in a wheelchair to the small apartment that once symbolized promise. Everyday tasks transformed into challenges: reaching the sink, navigating narrow doorways, adjusting to dependence. Clara visited frequently, helping rearrange furniture to accommodate accessibility. She spoke gently but honestly, reminding Tessa that dignity did not vanish with mobility. Yet when Clara left each evening, the silence grew heavy. Blake often stayed out later than usual, citing meetings or studio rehearsals. Caregiving was exhausting, not just physically but emotionally, and the imbalance between them deepened with each passing day. Financial strain layered itself onto emotional tension. Medical bills arrived steadily, their numbers impossible to ignore. Blake began calculating costs obsessively, comparing therapy expenses to his projected income growth. He reassured Tessa that everything would work out, but his tone carried stress rather than certainty. At night, he scrolled through career updates while she lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying Dr. Cole's words about patience. The weight of care was not just about physical assistance, it was about empathy, endurance, and shared responsibility. Tessa sensed Blake withdrawing slightly, not through cruelty but through avoidance. He preferred discussing studio lighting and ratings rather than neurological timelines. She noticed how he flinched when she asked for help adjusting her legs. It wasn't anger, it was discomfort. And discomfort, left unaddressed, has a way of growing. The accident had bound them together in crisis, but now the quiet, grinding reality of recovery tested something deeper: their capacity to withstand not just hardship, but vulnerability. Opportunity arrived with ruthless timing. Just as Tessa's rehabilitation entered its most uncertain phase, Blake received an offer that eclipsed everything he had worked for. A national sports network wanted him as a recurring analyst. The contract wasn't permanent yet, but it carried visibility far beyond regional broadcasts. Oliver called it a breakthrough. "This is the door," he said. "Step through it carefully." Blake stared at the offer letter in disbelief, the numbers larger than anything he had seen attached to his name before. When he told Tessa, she smiled genuinely, even as she adjusted herself in her wheelchair beside the kitchen counter. She told him she was proud. She meant it. But beneath her pride, there was a quiet fear that success was accelerating in one direction while recovery lagged painfully in another. Blake promised that nothing would change between them. Yet within days, his schedule tightened, studio rehearsals increased, and he began speaking in phrases shaped more by branding than by intimacy. The network's publicity team crafted a polished introduction for him, emphasizing determination, grit, and market appeal. When asked about his personal life during a pre-interview consultation, Blake hesitated before describing Tessa's condition as a private family situation. Oliver later advised him not to appear weighed down by visible hardship. "Audiences connect to aspiration," he repeated. Blake absorbed the strategy quickly. On camera, he was energetic and charismatic, delivering commentary with sharp precision. Viewers responded positively. Social media mentions increased. Sponsorship inquiries followed. At home, however, the rhythm felt different. Tessa noticed that he no longer shared every detail of his day. Instead, conversations revolved around networking events she could not easily attend and industry dinners scheduled without her consideration. He did not exclude her openly, but he stopped integrating her naturally into his rising world. It was a quiet shift, almost imperceptible at first, but it lingered in the space between them like unspoken tension. One evening, while Blake prepared for a major televised segment, Tessa watched him rehearse lines in front of a mirror. His posture was immaculate, his tone confident, his expression controlled. She admired his discipline, yet she could not ignore the distance that had settled into their home. When she asked if she could attend an upcoming studio recording, he hesitated briefly before explaining that accessibility logistics might be complicated. The explanation was practical, but the pause before it carried weight. Clara later visited and sensed the imbalance immediately, though she chose her words carefully. "Success reveals character," she said quietly after Blake left for rehearsal. Tessa nodded, unwilling to jump to conclusions yet unable to silence her intuition. Fame was no longer hypothetical, it was arriving quickly. And with it came a subtle question neither of them had yet answered: could loyalty survive ambition when the spotlight demanded constant polish? The studio lights were brighter than Blake had ever seen them, reflecting sharply off the polished glass desk where he sat beside two seasoned commentators. It was his first primetime national appearance, the kind that could cement his place in the industry permanently. Makeup artists adjusted his collar moments before the broadcast began, and Oliver stood just off camera, giving a final nod of approval. The segment flowed smoothly at first, confident analysis, quick-witted remarks, well-timed laughter. Blake felt the energy of national attention settling around him like armor. Then the host shifted the conversation unexpectedly, asking about the challenges he had overcome recently. Blake hesitated only briefly before offering a rehearsed smile. He spoke about resilience, about staying strong during personal trials. The host pressed further, asking about his wife's condition. The room fell quiet for a split second, the silence heavier than it should have been. In an attempt to deflect the emotional weight and keep the tone light, Blake laughed and uttered the words that would follow him relentlessly. He referred to Tessa as his crippled monkey, framing it as humor, as irony, as something playful. The audience reacted with uneasy laughter. The cameras did not blink. At home, Tessa watched the broadcast from the couch, her wheelchair positioned beside her. Clara had insisted on coming over to support her during the live segment, bringing takeout and optimism. The first half of the show filled Tessa with pride. Blake appeared confident, articulate, powerful. Then she heard it. The words landed with a force that felt physical. For a moment, she thought she had misheard him. Clara's hand tightened around hers. The audience's laughter echoed faintly through the speakers, distorted and surreal. Tessa felt her chest tighten, her throat constricting as the broadcast continued without pause. Blake's smile remained fixed on screen, unflinching. He did not correct himself. He did not clarify. The segment moved on as though nothing significant had happened. But in Tessa's living room, something irreversible shifted. The trust she had carried through hospital corridors and rehabilitation sessions cracked open under the weight of public humiliation. Within hours, the clip began circulating online. Social media divided sharply, some condemning the remark as cruel, others dismissing it as harmless humor taken out of context. Oliver's phone flooded with calls. Damage control discussions began immediately. Blake, stepping out of the studio, checked his messages and felt the first tremor of panic. He had meant to appear witty, resilient, untouchable. Instead, he sensed the narrative slipping beyond his control. When he returned home late that night, Tessa was awake, the television dark but the silence louder than any broadcast. She did not raise her voice. She did not cry. She simply asked, "Why?" Blake attempted to explain, pressure, nerves, misinterpretation, but the words felt thin. In chasing image, he had crossed a boundary that loyalty should have protected. The interview had ended hours ago. The damage had only begun. The morning after the interview felt colder than usual, even though the weather outside remained mild. News outlets replayed the clip repeatedly, dissecting Blake's words with sharp commentary. Some anchors called it insensitive, others labeled it careless arrogance. Blake sat at the kitchen table, staring at his phone as notifications continued flooding in. Sponsors were requesting clarification. Oliver urged him to issue a carefully worded statement emphasizing misinterpretation and stress. Tessa remained quiet in her wheelchair, watching him draft sentences that sounded polished but hollow. When she asked if he truly understood the hurt he had caused, Blake's frustration surfaced abruptly. He spoke about pressure, about how one wrong phrase could derail everything he had built. He insisted he had not meant it cruelly. But meaning and impact rarely align neatly. The conversation escalated slowly, then sharply. Blake's fear of losing public standing began overshadowing his remorse. In that fragile state, he said something harsher, that her presence, her condition, complicated his career narrative. The words hung in the air like smoke that refused to clear. By afternoon, the argument had reached a point of no return. Blake claimed he needed space to manage the crisis without additional complications. Tessa stared at him in disbelief as he suggested she temporarily move out. He framed it as practical, as strategic, but beneath the surface lay avoidance. Clara arrived within an hour, her expression hard but controlled. Together, she and Tessa began packing essentials, clothes, medical equipment, personal items, into boxes that seemed to multiply with each passing minute. Blake remained in the bedroom, pacing during calls with Oliver, avoiding direct eye contact. When Tessa rolled toward the doorway for the final time, she paused, glancing once more at the apartment where they had once whispered about shared dreams. There was no dramatic farewell, no apology strong enough to mend the fracture. There was only silence as Clara guided her toward the elevator, leaving behind not just furniture but a version of marriage that no longer existed. They settled into a modest rental across town, smaller but more accessible. Clara rearranged the space thoughtfully, ensuring Tessa could navigate comfortably. That evening, as the sun dipped below unfamiliar rooftops, Tessa allowed herself to feel the full weight of abandonment. The humiliation from television had been public, the eviction was deeply personal. Yet even within her pain, something steadier began to form, not anger, not vengeance, but clarity. Blake had chosen perception over partnership. The world outside continued debating his comment, unaware of the quieter betrayal unfolding behind closed doors. Meanwhile, messages of support began appearing online from viewers who recognized cruelty when they saw it. Sympathy gathered quietly around Tessa's name. She did not seek it, but it arrived nonetheless. And in that quiet apartment, surrounded by cardboard boxes and uncertainty, a subtle shift occurred. The woman once defined by her husband's ambition began stepping into an identity entirely her own. 3 weeks after the eviction, when the noise of the interview scandal had begun to settle into quieter commentary, a black sedan pulled up outside Clara's modest rental building. Tessa watched from the window as a tall, silver-haired man stepped out, adjusting his tailored coat before approaching the entrance. His presence carried the kind of quiet authority that did not require announcement. When he knocked, Clara answered cautiously. The man introduced himself as Elliot Vaughn, legal counsel to Lorraine Whitmore. At the mention of her estranged aunt's name, Tessa felt something tighten in her chest. Elliot explained calmly that Lorraine was gravely ill and had requested contact. He handed Tessa a sealed envelope embossed with an unfamiliar crest. Inside was a handwritten letter, brief but unmistakably sincere. Lorraine acknowledged years of silence, admitted regret over the rift with Miriam, and revealed that she had quietly followed Tessa's life from a distance. She had known about Greenmart. She had known about the accident. And she was not indifferent. Elliot returned the following day with more detail, speaking carefully about Lorraine's vast shipping empire, ports, warehouses, distribution contracts spanning multiple states. Tessa listened in stunned silence as he explained that Lorraine's will included a conditional inheritance clause. It was not automatic. Lorraine wanted assurance that her wealth would pass into hands capable of resilience and integrity. She had watched Blake's televised humiliation carefully. She had observed Tessa's quiet dignity in response. The clause, Elliot clarified, was based not on public opinion but on demonstrated character under adversity. Lorraine believed hardship revealed truth. The condition required Tessa to assume partial oversight responsibilities during Lorraine's final months, to observe operations firsthand, to prove both competence and moral steadiness. It was not a gift, it was a test. Clara sat beside her, eyes wide but steady, sensing that something monumental had just shifted. That evening, Tessa reread Lorraine's letter alone. The words were firm but reflective, written by someone who understood both power and regret. Lorraine admitted her conflict with Miriam had been fueled by pride and stubbornness, and she did not wish to repeat that mistake with the next generation. Tessa's hands trembled slightly as she traced the ink. For years, she had wondered whether her aunt even remembered her existence. Now she learned that Lorraine had quietly arranged educational investments in logistics firms, had monitored Greenmart's supply chains, had even ensured certain vendors treated Tessa fairly. The realization was overwhelming. The woman she had imagined as distant and indifferent had, in her own guarded way, been watching. As night settled around the small apartment, Tessa understood that her life was no longer defined solely by what she had lost. A door had opened, unexpected, complicated, and immense. The question was no longer whether she could survive humiliation. It was whether she could rise into responsibility far greater than she had ever imagined. Dr. Raymond Cole reviewed Tessa's latest neurological scans with cautious interest. The inflammation in her spine had reduced significantly, and while no guarantees could be offered, there were signs of potential reconnection along key nerve pathways. He introduced an advanced rehabilitation protocol, intensive, exhausting, and emotionally demanding. It would require longer sessions, specialized stimulation equipment, and mental resilience stronger than anything she had faced before. Tessa agreed without hesitation. She no longer viewed therapy as merely regaining mobility, it was reclaiming identity. Clara adjusted her work schedule to attend early morning sessions, while Mason Reed, who had remained quietly supportive since the accident, occasionally visited during breaks from his shifts. The therapy room became a battleground, not against doctors or machines, but against doubt. Every muscle tremor felt monumental. Every failed attempt felt crushing. But Tessa refused to retreat into self-pity. She treated each session like a negotiation with her own body, refusing to surrender authority over it. One afternoon, during a particularly grueling exercise, something subtle shifted. As Dr. Cole instructed her to focus intensely on visualizing movement, Tessa felt a faint twitch in her right foot. It was barely perceptible, more sensation than action. The therapist paused, watching carefully, then asked her to try again. Concentration sharpened. Sweat gathered at her temples. And there it was, a clearer, undeniable movement. Not full control, not strength, but response. The room went silent for a split second before Dr. Cole allowed himself a restrained smile. Progress rarely announces itself loudly, he reminded her. Tessa laughed through tears, overwhelmed by something she hadn't felt in months, proof. She chose not to share the development publicly. Not with reporters. Not with Blake. The victory was intimate, sacred. It belonged to her. That night, as she lay awake replaying the sensation in her mind, she realized something profound. The body that had once betrayed her was learning to trust her again. Meanwhile, Elliot Vaughn arranged for Tessa to tour one of Lorraine's regional distribution facilities, ensuring accessibility accommodations were prepared discreetly. The facility was vast, forklifts moving in precise choreography, shipments tracked meticulously, managers reporting to centralized systems with disciplined efficiency. For the first time, Tessa witnessed the scale of Lorraine's empire. It was not glamorous, it was structured, deliberate, powerful. As she observed operations, she noticed inefficiencies in local grocery supply routes, making mental notes instinctively. The dream journal she once carried in a grocery aisle now translated into real logistical insight. Elliot watched quietly, recognizing competence rather than curiosity. That evening, Lorraine herself requested a video call. Her voice, though weakened by illness, carried unmistakable authority. She spoke not of wealth but of responsibility. Strength, Lorraine said softly, is revealed not when life goes as planned, but when it does not. Tessa listened carefully, understanding that her recovery was unfolding on two fronts, physical and strategic. Both required patience. Both demanded resolve. And both were finally beginning to move. While Tessa focused on rehabilitation and quiet preparation for Lorraine's conditional oversight, another narrative was unfolding beyond her awareness. Riley Grant, an investigative journalist, known for methodical research rather than sensationalism, began reviewing inconsistencies surrounding the accident. Initially, the televised remark had caught her attention, not merely for its cruelty, but for Blake's evasiveness in subsequent interviews. Riley had long-standing professional connections with shipping magnates, including Lorraine Whitmore, though she never publicly acknowledged that relationship. When she requested access to traffic reports and emergency response timelines, she did so under the pretext of writing about distracted driving statistics. What she uncovered unsettled her. The accident report listed no mechanical failures. Weather conditions were moderate. Yet witness accounts suggested a momentary lapse in attention before the collision. Riley was not interested in humiliating Blake, she was interested in truth. And truth, she understood, rarely remained buried forever. Through formal records and quiet interviews, Riley confirmed that Blake's phone had registered activity seconds before impact. The timestamp aligned precisely with Oliver Kane's outgoing message. It was not a lengthy exchange, not an extended distraction, but it was enough. Riley paused before proceeding further. She knew the implications extended beyond a careless comment on live television. This was not about optics. It was about accountability. Meanwhile, Blake sensed a shift in public tone as online commentary resurfaced questions about the crash itself. Oliver reassured him that speculation would fade, urging him to maintain composure and avoid defensive statements. Yet beneath Blake's confident exterior, unease began to grow. He replayed the night of the accident in his mind, recalling the vibration of his phone, the split-second glance downward. He had convinced himself it was insignificant. Now, as murmurs resurfaced, he feared that the moment he tried hardest to forget might become impossible to outrun. Unaware of the investigation gathering momentum, Tessa continued strengthening both body and strategy. Her right foot now responded more consistently during therapy, and Dr. Cole adjusted her program accordingly. She felt progress threading quietly through her limbs, though she guarded the development closely. At the same time, she studied distribution analytics provided by Elliot Vaughn, identifying cost redundancies that even senior managers had overlooked. Lorraine's video calls grew more frequent, her tone increasingly reflective. She hinted that certain safeguards had been established long before the accident, protective measures designed to shield Tessa from financial vulnerability. Tessa did not yet understand the full extent of what Lorraine meant, but she sensed complexity beneath the surface. As one storyline built toward exposure and another toward empowerment, the tension between them tightened. The accident that had fractured her life was no longer just a tragic event, it was becoming a focal point of revelation. And revelation, when it arrives, rarely spares anyone unprepared for its consequences. The morning Tessa stood for the first time without assistance, there were no cameras, no applause, no dramatic soundtrack to mark the moment. It happened in the quiet rehabilitation room, sunlight filtering through wide windows as Dr. Raymond Cole observed carefully. With controlled breathing and deliberate focus, she shifted her weight forward, gripping parallel bars as her legs trembled beneath her. The first attempt lasted only seconds before fatigue forced her back into the wheelchair. But the second attempt held longer. Her knees locked, her spine steadied, and she remained upright, unsteady but undeniable. Tears gathered in her eyes, not from pain but from recognition. Her body was responding. Progress had transformed from possibility into proof. She requested discretion from the medical team, wanting no premature announcements. This victory was not for headlines. It was for herself. After months of humiliation and doubt, standing felt like reclaiming sovereignty over her own narrative. Later that week, Elliot Vaughn contacted her with news that altered everything. Lorraine Whitmore's condition had deteriorated rapidly. Tessa traveled, this time using assisted mobility but with growing strength, to Lorraine's private residence overlooking a quiet harbor. The estate was vast yet understated, its design reflecting precision rather than extravagance. Lorraine greeted her from a reclining chair, her presence weakened but her gaze sharp. In that final meeting, Lorraine spoke candidly about regret, foresight, and legacy. She revealed that long before the accident, she had structured her empire's succession carefully. The distribution networks supplying regional grocery chains, including Green Mart, were consolidated under a holding structure designed to transfer majority control to Tessa upon meeting the resilience clause. It was not charity. It was deliberate succession. Lorraine passed away 2 days later, peacefully but resolute, leaving behind not just wealth but responsibility on a scale Tessa had never imagined. The formal reading of the will confirmed what Elliot had carefully prepared her to understand. Tessa Whitmore was now the primary controlling stakeholder of a multi-state distribution network encompassing shipping ports, storage facilities, and supplier contracts. The scope was staggering. Yet amid the gravity of inheritance, Tessa chose restraint. She did not announce her mobility progress publicly. She did not contact Blake. Instead, she reviewed financial structures, studied operational frameworks, and scheduled private strategy sessions with senior managers. The woman once dismissed as a grocery store cashier now held authority over the very supply chains that fed national retail networks. As she practiced walking short distances alone in her new residence, she understood something profound: the accident had not ended her life. It had revealed capacities she might never have discovered otherwise. And somewhere beyond her knowledge, forces investigating the truth of that accident were moving closer to exposure. Riley Grant did not rush her findings. She compiled them carefully, cross-checking traffic data, phone records obtained legally through public documentation, and statements given the night of the accident. When she finally published her investigative piece, it was not sensational but precise. The article laid out a timeline showing that Blake Harrington's phone registered activity at the exact second witnesses reported his vehicle drifting. It did not accuse recklessness outright, it simply presented verifiable facts and asked a direct question about accountability. The piece gained traction within hours. Commentators who had once debated his televised remark now shifted focus to the cause of the crash itself. Social media ignited again, this time with a different tone, less about insensitive humor, more about responsibility. Sponsors who had cautiously distanced themselves after the interview now withdrew formally. The network issued a statement emphasizing internal review. Blake, watching the narrative unravel in real time, felt something far heavier than embarrassment. He felt exposure. Oliver Kane attempted damage control initially, urging Blake to frame the phone activity as insignificant and unrelated to the collision. But the evidence was clear and unemotional. It did not shout, it simply existed. Executives called emergency meetings. Blake was informed that his appearances would be suspended pending investigation. For the first time in his accelerating career, doors did not open, they closed. Oliver, pragmatic as ever, quietly reduced communication. He advised Blake to focus on legal counsel and public apologies, distancing himself professionally. The speed of abandonment shocked Blake more than the criticism itself. The same industry that had elevated him now stepped back with calculated caution. Alone in his upscale apartment, he replayed the accident in his mind, no longer able to dismiss the significance of that glance at his phone. Ambition had always been his shield. Now it felt like the very thing that had driven him into distraction. Meanwhile, Tessa observed the unfolding scandal from a position of unexpected calm. She had already begun walking short distances unassisted within her residence, though she maintained her wheelchair in public for strategic discretion. Elliot Vaughn informed her that the distribution network's leadership board had expressed confidence in her measured approach. Green Mart's executives, unaware of her full ownership position, negotiated contracts under the same systems she now controlled quietly. Clara visited frequently, astonished at the scale of transformation but respecting Tessa's choice for privacy. Mason Reed, too, had noticed the subtle strength in her posture during recent encounters, though he said nothing. As headlines dissected Blake's collapse, Tessa did not celebrate. She did not retaliate publicly. She focused instead on logistics meetings, recovery exercises, and steady expansion plans. The accident had revealed character on multiple fronts. Now, as Blake's carefully constructed image fractured, Tessa's quiet foundation strengthened. And the world had yet to discover just how firmly she now stood. Blake had rehearsed what he would say at least a dozen times before knocking on Tessa's door. His career was suspended, sponsorships withdrawn, and Oliver had stopped returning his calls with the urgency he once did. The apartment he had upgraded to felt hollow now, filled with echoes of ambition but empty of loyalty. When he learned through quiet industry whispers that Tessa had been seen visiting major distribution facilities connected to Greenmart's supply chain, curiosity turned into confusion. He had assumed she was surviving quietly somewhere, perhaps still in rehabilitation. The truth unsettled him. When the door opened, he was prepared to see her in a wheelchair. Instead, he saw her standing, steady, composed, stronger than he remembered. She did not lean on anything. She did not falter. The silence between them stretched longer than any argument they had ever shared. He stammered at first, searching for the right tone. He spoke of regret, of pressure, of mistakes amplified by cameras and pride. He admitted the interview had been reckless, that fear of losing momentum had clouded his judgment. Tessa listened without interruption, her posture calm, her gaze direct. She did not mention the nights she had cried in unfamiliar rooms. She did not recount the humiliation of being dismissed as a liability. Instead, she spoke plainly. Recovery had taught her something Blake never valued: patience. Strength was not loud. It was disciplined. When he asked about the rumors surrounding her new business involvement, she revealed just enough. She now oversaw the very distribution network supplying Greenmart and several affiliated retailers. The grocery aisles he once dismissed as modest were now supported by infrastructure she controlled. Blake absorbed the information slowly, the irony settling heavily in his chest. The world he had sought to dominate through endorsements was structurally connected to her authority. As the conversation deepened, Blake asked if there was room for reconciliation. His voice carried sincerity, but also desperation. Tessa did not answer immediately. She walked, deliberately, confidently, across the room without assistance, allowing him to witness fully what he had underestimated. Recovery, she said quietly, requires accountability. She explained that forgiveness was not the same as restoration. Trust, once fractured publicly and privately, could not be patched by apology alone. Outside, traffic moved steadily along the street, indifferent to the personal reckoning unfolding inside. Blake realized that for the first time since the accident, he was not negotiating image. He was confronting consequence. Tessa had risen not through revenge, but through resilience. And as he left that apartment, alone again, he understood that success built without empathy collapses quickly. Meanwhile, Tessa closed the door gently, not with anger, but with clarity. Her life was no longer orbiting his ambition. It was charting its own course. The final layer of revelation arrived not through headlines, but through documentation. Elliot Vaughn invited Tessa to review confidential files Lorraine had instructed him to release only after Blake's public collapse. Inside the secured portfolio were investigative summaries dating back years, long before the accident, long before national television appearances. Lorraine had commissioned background evaluations on anyone entering Tessa's life seriously, not out of paranoia, but prudence. Blake's ambition had been evident from the beginning. Reports described his financial volatility, his sensitivity to status, and his tendency to recalibrate relationships based on perceived upward mobility. Lorraine had never interfered openly, she had observed quietly. Most striking, however, was the structural design of her estate. The distribution network Blake once hoped to leverage through endorsements had been strategically positioned to transfer entirely outside any marital claim. Even if Tessa had remained in that marriage, the inheritance was legally insulated from spousal access. Lorraine had foreseen the possibility of opportunism and built protection accordingly. Tessa absorbed the information with composed astonishment. The accident, devastating as it had been, was never the true pivot point. Lorraine had already positioned the Empire in anticipation of potential instability. The resilience clause was not simply about recovery from paralysis, it was about character under pressure. Had Tessa responded with bitterness, public retaliation, or reckless decisions, the transfer could have been delayed. Instead, her restraint had fulfilled Lorraine's deepest expectation. Meanwhile, Blake, unaware of these safeguards, had once casually imagined leveraging high-profile partnerships with grocery supply chains for personal brand elevation. He never knew that the very infrastructure he dreamed of endorsing was structurally destined to fall under Tessa's control. The empire he sought to impress would have quietly bypassed him regardless. The ultimate twist was not vengeance, it was inevitability shaped by foresight. When Blake learned indirectly through legal correspondence that Tessa's holdings were protected years before the accident, a different kind of realization settled over him. His rise and fall had not been orchestrated by her reaction to humiliation. It had been shaped by his own choices, long predicted by someone he underestimated entirely. Riley Grant later published a measured follow-up analysis highlighting corporate governance lessons drawn from Lorraine's estate planning, without revealing personal details. The story shifted from scandal to strategy. In quiet reflection, Tessa recognized that Lorraine's final gift was not wealth, it was autonomy shielded from instability. The accident had revealed character. The inheritance had revealed preparation. And the humiliation that once defined headlines was now overshadowed by something far more powerful, structural justice built long before crisis struck. The twist was simple yet profound. Strength had always been anticipated, protected, and waiting to emerge. The harbor was quiet the morning Tessa Whitmore officially signed her first expansion directive as principal executive of Whitmore Distribution Holdings. There were no dramatic announcements, no cameras flashing, no triumphant speeches. She preferred precision over spectacle. From her office overlooking the water, she reviewed logistics blueprints outlining ethical sourcing, fair labor standards, and improved efficiency for neighborhood grocery supply chains. Greenmart's executives still did not fully grasp the scale of her authority, they simply recognized improved operations and steady leadership. Clara Bennett had recently accepted a district-level educational advisory role, inspired in part by witnessing Tessa's transformation from survival to sovereignty. Mason Reed, having observed her steady recovery with quiet admiration, now consulted on safety protocols for company transport divisions, ensuring distracted driving prevention was embedded into corporate culture. Tessa's progress was not loud, but it was structural, deliberate, lasting. Blake Harrington's life moved differently now. After months of suspension and public scrutiny, he secured a modest position at a local radio station, far from prime time, but steady. The spotlight that once defined him had dimmed, replaced by a quieter accountability. In rare interviews, he acknowledged the accident and the harm his words had caused without deflection. The arrogance that once drove him had softened into something closer to humility. He no longer chased dominance, he worked toward stability. Though he and Tessa remained separated, there was no bitterness in her stance. She did not need his downfall to validate her strength. She needed only clarity. Riley Grant continued investigative journalism with integrity intact, while Elliot Vaughn finalized estate restructuring processes that ensured long-term resilience beyond any single executive. Lorraine Whitmore's legacy was no longer an isolated empire, it was evolving under hands that understood both struggle and stewardship. One evening, months after her first unassisted steps, Tessa walked alone along the harbor pier without a wheelchair in sight. The air carried the scent of salt and renewal. She paused briefly, reflecting not on humiliation or inheritance, but on the lesson threaded through every chapter of her journey: adversity reveals truth. The accident had exposed fragility, the interview had exposed character, and the inheritance had exposed preparation. Strength had not arrived suddenly, it had been cultivated quietly through endurance. She understood now that dignity outlasts spectacle, and resilience outlives reputation. As twilight settled over the water, she turned back toward the city, not as a woman defined by paralysis or mockery, but as a leader shaped by discipline and foresight. Her story had never been about revenge. It had been about revelation. And in that revelation, she found something far greater than victory, she found balance. Thank you for listening to Luxurious Tales. If this tale moved you, share it with someone, leave a comment, and let us know what you felt. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new story. Until next time.